There's a job in your salon that nobody trained you for, nobody told you it existed, and no one is paying you for it right now. But it's actually the highest paying job in the building. And here's what's wild: the owners who figure it out, their salons grow, almost like the business starts pulling them forward instead of them pushing it. And the ones who don't, they work harder every year. They hire more people, and somehow they end up more exhausted, more stuck, and even more alone. And today, we want to show you what that job is.
Yeah. So before we get into today's episode, I want to ask you something like, how are you doing? Like, truly, how are you doing? Not your salon, but you. Because if you're like the most owners that I know I talk to, I'm sure Lindsay, you get this as well as, you hear things like, hey, you're tired. You're not lazy tired, not need a vacation tired. You're carrying everything tired. The kind of tired when you lie awake at night running through the list. Oh, yeah, this, right? You got to think about who called in, what client complained, whether your team is actually growing or just getting older. And if that's you, this episode is designed for you because what I'm about to share changed everything for how I know I and Lindsay as well see this industry and this business.
Yeah. So, I was actually on the salon floor not that long ago, and I overheard one of uh, our team members with a guest. She was very kind. She was trying, and she said something like, "Do you want to stay warm or go more cool?" And the guest froze. You could feel the temperature in the conversation drop because she didn't know what that meant. She didn't know how to answer. And so she did what confused people always do. She said no. No to the color change, no to the dimension, no to the product recommendations. And on the surface, nothing went wrong. The transaction was completed, the guest left. But underneath, everything went wrong because that guest walked out smaller than she could have walked out. And that beauty pro stayed stuck right where she was. And the revenue that should have been there wasn't. Now here's what I didn't do in that moment. I didn't walk over and fix it. I didn't correct her in front of the guest. I didn't pull her aside and say, next time, say this instead, because I've learned something. That's not the job.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. I can relate to that story as well. And I know some of you listening right now, you've been the owner who jumps in. I've been the owner who jumps in. There's no judgment here, just as an opportunity to become aware. And we do it because it's easier, right? It's because you know exactly what to say. And because the clock is ticking and the guest is right there. And you're like, I can handle this. I got this. And maybe you're thinking right now, Jen, what's wrong with that? You know, I got the yes, the guest was happy, the problem was solved. But here's the question that I truly want to set with you: is like, who solved it? You did, not your team, you. And if it's always you, what happens on the days when you're not there? What happens when you take a day off? What happens when you want to step back? What happens when you want to scale? The answer is always the same. Everything waits for you. And deep down, you already know this. You've probably actually known it for a while.
Yeah, because here's what no one told you when you opened your salon. You thought the job was to be excellent. And you are. You thought the job was to build a loyal clientele, and you did. And maybe you thought the job was to hire good people and create a great experience, and you're trying. But there's actually two jobs inside of your business. There's the visible job, which is, doing hair, running payroll, managing schedules, solving today's problems. And then there's the invisible job, building the people who do the visible job. And here's the hard truth: most salon owners are world class at the visible job and completely untrained in the invisible one. And it's not because they're not smart, and it's definitely not because they don't care, but it's because no one told them it existed.
You're probably thinking, "So, what is this invisible job exactly?" Right? And truly, like, I can give it to you in one sentence. So, are you ready? This is a writer downer. The invisible job is thinking for your people until they can think for themselves. Thinking for your people until they can think for themselves. Write it down, say it out loud if you need to. Thinking for your people until they can think for themselves. That's it. Not doing their job for them, not fixing their mistakes, not being the smartest person in the room every single time, but teaching them how to think the way you think. Because truly, like, here's what I've come to understand: behavior doesn't change first, belief changes first. If your team member believes, I don't want to be pushy, she will hold back or he will hold back every single time without fail. But if they believe, hey, guests don't really want to spend money, she will under recommend every time without fail. And if she believes I'm not good at selling, or if he believes I'm not good at selling, they have already decided the outcome before the guest even sits down. And you guys, no script fixes that. No sales training fixes that. You can give her the perfect words and they will deliver them in a way that doesn't work because the words are coming from the wrong belief. The invisible job is changing the belief first.
Yeah, so you might be thinking, so how do you actually do that? Well, great, you're at the right episode because we're going to talk about the three shifts. Shift one is you stop giving answers and you start teaching thinking. So instead of saying, next time, say this, you say, what do you think was happening for the guest in that moment? You create the space where they see it, because the moment they can see it, they can solve it without you. Shift two is you start naming the beliefs out loud. When you hear someone say, I don't want to be pushy, you don't ignore it. You stop, you look at them and you say, that belief is costing you money and it's costing your guests results because you're holding something back. So let's talk about that. You don't say this harshly, you say it with love. You can say it directly, but in a loving way, because a belief that goes unnamed goes unchanged. And then that takes us to shift three, which is you measure thinking, not just performance. Most owners track numbers, and yes, numbers are telling us a story about what's happening. When you think about retail sales or rebooking rates or average ticket, but those are lagging indicators. So they tell us what already happened. So if you start asking, how did my team member think about that guest today? What decision did she make and why? Did she lead or did she wait? Because when the thinking improves, the numbers always follow.
Lindsay, one of our mentors was saying this the other day. They were saying a phrase that we hear most often is seeing is believing. But, like, if you think about that, that truly keeps you on a hamster wheel because you gotta see it and then you gotta believe it. You gotta see it and then you gotta believe it. But if we shift that perspective and know that believing is seeing, wow, you gotta believe it before you can even see it. And, like, just like that framework you just walked through on getting your team to think, that truly is the perspective you have to come from it and help them to see that believing is seeing. Because truly, when that happens, this is where everything changes. There's two kinds of salon owners. There's the service provider owner. She's talented, she's hardworking. I've been her. She's the backbone of everything. And she is exhausted because the salon runs on her, not with her. And then there's the salon owner, and she still cares deeply about the work, but her job has evolved. She is not the best in the room. She is not the one making everyone in the room better. And her salon grows when she's there and grows when she's not. And here's the question that will change your week. Which one are you being right now? The service provider salon owner or the service provider owner or the salon owner? You know, not which one do you want to be, which one are you truly being? Because the shift doesn't happen when you get more guests or more clients or more team members or more space. It happens the moment that you decide, my job is not to do the work. My job is to build the people who do the work. That's the identity shift. And everything downstream of that decision changes.
Ah, I love that. I love that you said, she's not the best in the room. She is the one making everyone better in the room. And,
Mhm.
I want to leave you with this. Every time you jump in and fix it, you get the win in that moment, but you pay for it later because your team learns one thing from that moment. She'll handle it. And that belief, that quiet, unspoken belief, becomes the most expensive thing in your business. More expensive than a bad hire, more expensive than a slow month, more expensive than any mistake your team could make on the floor. Because it's the belief that keeps you trapped, keeps you working harder each year with less to show for it. And I don't want that for you. So this week, don't try to fix everything. Listen instead. Listen for how your team is thinking, not what they're doing, but how they're thinking. And ask one question when something goes sideways. What were you thinking in that moment? That one question that starts the invisible job.
Yeah, because the salons that scale are not always the ones with the most talent. They're the ones with the best thinking, and thinking can be taught. That's your job now, and nobody else can do it but you. So we'll see you next week.